Well, I'm so thrilled to be able to be here and have a proper in-depth conversation about this truly, truly wonderful book that is, you know, the book that I wish I had read 6 years ago or so. And I say that as somebody who felt very allergic to the whole idea of motherhood books and resisted every single primer out there. But I think that, you know, from a publishing perspective, that market has changed a lot in the past 5 years or so. And I know that when your book was reviewed in The Guardian a few days ago, it was reviewed with a couple of other motherhood memoirs. And I've also noticed it, you know, I read a lot of fiction, I've also noticed it being broached as a theme in literary fiction in a way that I just don't think would have been the case 5, certainly 10 years ago. I wondered what you think has been the impetus for this debate to be opened up, you know, long overdue. So why now? You know, you say that motherhood is feminism's unfinished business, but it's been that way for a while.
It has. I mean, it's very interesting that there are all these books out now about really joining the dots when it comes to motherhood. So looking at general trends in motherhood and some of the general problems with the way that motherhood is managed today. And I guess some years ago, there started to appear some memoirs about the motherhood experience. So, I mean, obviously there've been memoirs in the past, but I noticed quite a collection of memoirs appearing, you know, in recent years, talking about the subjective individual experience of motherhood. But interestingly now, what seems to be happening is that motherhood as a phenomenon is being written about in more general terms. And that's, I think, is really important for me, because for this book, I really wanted to politicize motherhood and to look in the round at the problems with the way it's managed, because I think that so often mothers experience the problems with the way that it's managed on a very individual basis, and mothers are very isolated within their own homes, and they feel often guilty for complaining about their experience because of accusations of privilege, or that they're somehow ungrateful. So I think when I first had children, you know, 11 years ago, I was really looking for that more general validation of some of the downsides of the experience, so that so that it wouldn't just be my own individual failings. So it is interesting. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is that you know, it's not the first time that women and feminists have written about motherhood. You know, that obviously feminism goes in waves, and with the first wave there was a real campaign for things like pain relief in childbirth. You know, the suffragettes campaigned for better maternity care, including pain relief. The second wavers, you know, held consciousness raising groups where they, you know, campaigned for the right to escape from domestic enslavement as they saw it, and the right to indeed remain childless. So it's interesting how these things go in waves. But I think that while in recent years, in political terms, we've had the Me Too movement looking at harassment and so on, really important campaign there. But what I would really like to see is to politicize the campaign for better motherhood.
How long had you been thinking about the book before you sat down to write it and began researching in earnest?
Yeah, well, I guess I had already become interested in the history of the natural childbirth movement even before I had my first baby, because I was already feeling pressure to give birth in a certain way, i.e. without pain relief, to have a certain so-called natural birth without interventions doctors and so on. So I was interested in where that pressure was coming from. And so, and that was coming from, I suppose from antenatal classes and the media and so on, but where had it actually originated? So I did some research into the history of that movement. And what I found was that not only was there a really determined attempt to persuade women to give birth without pain relief in the middle of the 20th century, often making quite dubious claims about eugenics and saying, well, we need to persuade the better sort of women to give birth without pain relief so that more women will have, more of those kinds of women will have babies. So and also making claims about childbirth, like, it doesn't hurt if you're doing it right. Things like that.
The whole hypnobirthing thing, and the idea that the pain is a social construct, and we're just, because we hear from infancy that it's a painful experience, we're therefore anticipating it. But
exactly,
it's real.
That's right. So I think I'd already become interested in that, and then I guess my own birth experience, my first baby, conformed exactly to my worst fears. Really, I was told to go home because my labour wasn't properly established by the midwife, and then actually went on to have quite a traumatic emergency cesarean under general anaesthetic. So I think that experience really giving flesh to the bones of my research really made me want to write more about this subject in general.
And then presumably the business of motherhood got largely in the way, and you were turning the thought over and over. And was the research conducted on a sort of piecemeal basis, or had you sat down, you had the proposal, you had a deadline?
Well, I just wanted to write about politics when the kids were really young, because I was really terrified that my brain would turn to mush, which is what I was told. And so many of my friends, I saw their careers sort of flatline really when they had babies, and particularly also when their kids went to school. And so I was really desperate to keep hold of my kind of, my public interests, I guess. So writing about politics. And so the last thing I wanted to write about was motherhood, actually. But I felt like the experience of motherhood was kind of quietly accumulating in my head, and the critique was quietly accumulating as well. I think it's also, when your children are very young, I think it's really hard to see the experience objectively. And so I think now that they're 9 and 11, it's become easier to join the dots and to see, and to start to see patterns in terms of the problematic ways in which motherhood is currently managed. So I think it took a while for those patterns to coalesce.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you allude there to the immense pressure that you personally felt, and that it's definitely out there to go the natural route, because I suppose that initially started as its own rebellion against the medicalization of childbirth. And it's the same with breastfeeding. I remember my own mum telling me that they looked askance when she told them, in Norfolk, whenever it was in the 1970s, that she was going to breastfeed, and they were having none of that. And who is this hippie? And it's, these things start out as being motivated for the good and being about choice, but it becomes so restrictive so soon. And it seems particularly pronounced in areas in motherhood. And I wonder if you said just now that it took you a while to join the dots, and I think we're, for a long time, and we're just so sleep starved. I'd certainly, if you sit down and try and write something, you can manage maybe 70 words and that's it. And I think we're probably in the very least, we're least well placed to stand up for ourselves and our own autonomy and resist that immense pressure. So it's hard to know, I suppose, how that might be changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the origins of the natural childbirth movement. Yeah, it was really understandable reaction to the paternalistic medical establishment at the time.
The pendulum just swings from one extreme to the other with very little autonomy for the mother.
Yeah,
who is immediately referred to as mum. I mean, I remember hating it. Certain midwives would call you mum, and I just thought, no.
That's right. I know, it's really intolerable. And like a lot of the language around pregnancy, what to eat or drink in pregnancy is very patronizing as well. Better avoid any alcohol just in case, or better to be safe than sorry, and all of that kind of.
And you're so racked by morning sickness that you just go with it anyway, because frankly, anything more than a rice cake and you know.
Yeah. So I guess, so I think, so originally there was this reaction against paternalism, which I think was really valid. And I think, second wave feminism, to give birth, in that kind of autonomous way, without medical assistance, was really empowering for those women. So I really understand that. But I think that what's happened now is that the pendulum has swung, as you say, too far the other way. And that actually now we still have the sense that that giving birth naturally is the sort of underdog option, that you're going to be, you're going to have drugs sort of forced upon you whether you like it or not. And I think what actually is the case is that the pressure is in the other direction, that women are told that they've done very well.
I know it's got to be as bliss. I do have heard people tell me it was this blissful experience, and they were in this kind of Zen trance, and I suppose that is the one aspect of the whole process where your choice really is emphasized, and you're encouraged to believe that you can come up with this birth plan, which I mean, labour starts, and frankly that goes out the window, doesn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, I think it's good in a way to write a birth plan and to have it. It focuses your mind on what you would like, in an ideal world, to happen,
so that your hopes can be dashed.
Yeah. But I think the problem is that you have this rhetoric of choice, and actually I do support all women's decisions to have any kind of birth they want. In a field, on a labour ward, with or without pain relief, absolutely. But the problem, I think, is that is not a free choice when one side is valorized and validated and the other one isn't. So I think that the culture, we have to be honest really about the subtle messages that we send to women who have cesareans, who have an epidural, and who therefore feel like they failed. And actually, if we're going to have a free choice, that means not judging women who either make a certain choice or end up having a certain kind of birth because of circumstances dictate it. So I think motherhood is really defined by these two poles. It's the natural and it's the perfect, and and both of those are questionable, because what is natural childbirth, what is natural motherhood? Actually, it's a kind of very particular Western elite style of childbearing. Which is you have you give birth in a pool with incense, you exactly, you wear your baby in a sling, you sleep with your baby, you have organic,
and it's quite expensive. It's very expensive,
make at home. Exactly,
it's completely commodified, and it's expensive. And then those messages are so insidious, though, aren't they? Because I definitely didn't read any of those books, and because I have come to do this as a single mother by choice, so I felt as if I had a bit more wiggle room, because it felt like a sort of a new area, and but on the other hand, you've gone to all this trouble. My gosh, you have to, so the pressure to absolutely never to complain about any aspect of it was immense. But there were certainly no NCT classes, and so I still, that inner voice in my head, the guilt and the anxiety were completely fueled by the response, what fills the pages of your book, and I somehow absorbed all of this without having gone near the parenting section of the bookshop, or even read any of the blogs.
I mean, I didn't read any advice books either, because I felt like I had this very quiet inner voice that if I read anything, it would immediately drown out any kind of slight maternal instinct, such as it is. Clearly it's a myth, but just listening to my baby, actually, trying to tune into my baby, and actually the advice industry was incredibly clamorous. But also, as I've been saying, the advice industry, you get the impression that there's this great plethora of advice, it's a kind of marketplace of ideas. And actually, Gina Ford, who advocates sleep training, she's vilified, on parenting forums online and so on. So, not that I'm necessarily advocating sleep training, but I just think that we have to be honest as a culture about the fact that, you know, only a certain kind of child rearing is one that we approve of. And also that, you know, the majority of mothers, I think, just mix and match. You know, I tried
and it's, you know,
breastfeeding, I tried bottle feeding, you know, it's fine. You just sort of muddle through, but actually the debate is so ideological. It's incredibly stressful and divisive.
Yes. When you're at your lowest ebb, you know, just based on a basic mental functioning level.
And also, you know, the history of child rearing is incredibly varied, and yet that's really easy to forget now when the advice industry is pushing a certain way of, you know, and it's very, very perfectionist, you know, the idea that if you put one foot wrong, your child will be scarred for life, you know. And I think, you know, in the past, you know, as I talk about in the book, you know, the whole variety of different methods in child rearing, you know, all the way from giving birth at home or in hospital, breastfeeding or bottle feeding, wet nursing, you know, taking your baby to work, having extended family, looking after your child, or even siblings, different ways of interacting with your child, you know, to play with your child or actually not to play. You know, playing with your child is quite a recent Western practice, and before, you know, the 20th century, playing with your child was thought to, you know, be sort of overindulgent and damaging, actually. So, you know, and I think it's really salutary to see that there was this great variety of different methods, and actually in great understanding, you know, from psychologists and psychoanalysts to psychiatrists to childcare experts. You know, there was a great degree of tolerance for mothers, actually, that I think has disappeared now.
And I think you're right. I mean, obviously, you know, we think of in hindsight, it's easy to spot how terribly representative of their era each of these different distinct but equally rigid stances were. So, you know, and also I suppose how class bound they were. So the idea of the children seeing the parents once a day in the Victorian nursery, and you've got, you know, down the road there'd be something very different going on. But I suppose it's harder to know when you're in the thick of it quite what our, you know, once supernatural and yet incredibly perfectionist stance says about us. And I was very interested just at the end where you bring in social media and the role that has played in its, you know, endless pursuit to airbrush every corner of life and filter it.
Yeah, well, that's just one of the ways in which I think motherhood has become harder now, that, you know, as you say, you know, we kind of look at each other people's perfect lives on Instagram. You know, the motherhood forums, in some ways they provide solidarity and advice, but in other ways they can be very judgmental and passive aggressive. You know, so actually, you know, social media really hasn't provided any kind of, you know, joined up solidarity that maybe even the Me Too movement had, which is, it's interesting to think why that is. I think it's partly this, you know, the guilt and the judgment, that, you know, unlike other movements or other feminist campaigns, because there's this vulnerable person in the equation, the child, you know, that kind of drains the energy from the campaigning, and drains the energy out of any claims that mothers make for themselves. But as I try to argue, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, the interests of the mother and the child are not opposed, and that a happy child has a happy mother. So it's really important to try and destigmatize, you know, ordinary imperfection, because as well as the perfectionist advice that we're given, you know, explicitly and also implicitly in the culture, mothers are incredibly hard on ourselves, and I beat myself up every day. I feel guilty for something I've done. You know, looking at my emails when my children are in the flat, you know, eating the wrong, going back, you know, all the way back to the beginning, you know, eating the wrong food when I was pregnant. Trying to work the right number of days, you know, which is like a constant
it's impossible
reevaluation.
Because they're changing all the time. I mean, the idea that you can, you know, every child is different, and every child is different from week to week, but they're tiny, aren't they? It's impossible. Also, you change. I mean, that's the other thing.
Yes.
But you're right. I mean, the only arena more judgmental than a Mumsnet thread is, you know, the conversation you have with yourself in the mirror, isn't it? It's just, and there's a chapter in the book which was
really a chapter that I feel very strongly about, but it was so difficult to write, which is about anger and discipline.
Yes, and you raise your hands and you say, I am against spanking, but occasionally, a handful of times, and you're right, nobody ever comes clean about that.
Yeah, the majority of parents there's been studies, the majority of parents in the UK have spanked their children, and a large majority shout. And that's and I'm not condoning that at all, but the reality of family life is that there are ups and downs, and mothers lose their temper, especially when it's in the middle of the week and it's between 5 and 7 and their partners are still out at work and they're tired and they're hungry and they've got more than one child and they're bickering or they've got a toddler playing up, and that's just the reality. And yet, you go on the parenting advice forums and the advice you're given is positive reinforcement and leading by example. And on the Dr. Sears website, it says, well, there's even if there's 100 to 1 hug to hit ratio, you may,
that's it, you've done it,
damage your child, and or words to that effect. So so I just think we need to kind of there needs to be more of a match between the advice and the reality, because otherwise the gap between those two things is the guilt.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny also because I think I've binge watched the latest series of Motherhood, and it's all we can laugh at this stuff, and yet I don't know
Motherland.
if it's making us any more that's it, sorry. I don't know if it's making us any more honest about it. Much in the same way that we're bombarded with female villains, but it doesn't make us feel any less need to be paragons of perfect virtue in real life.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Motherland. I mean, I think Motherland is hilarious, actually, and it's very, and I suppose it's clever. It's related to the slummy mummy genre in the sense that it shows mothers, it shows the downsides very clearly, but there's something about the kind of clownishness of mothers in those portrayals, which are, mothers are kind of falling on their faces, and it's sort of pratfall humor, and actually there's something slightly reinforcing really about that. And of course it's satire, so it's not a political treatise, but I do think there's in a way that in order to depict the mothers kind of failing, then there is something depressingly reinforcing about that. And also I just think I mean, I suppose campaigns for change are not necessarily that funny, but but the humor is a kind of a safety valve, isn't it? It's a sort of release.
And I was trying to, just before I logged onto the conversation, I was trying to remember the title of a novel that I read that was so cute on this, because I think maybe novelists feel like they've got more freedom because it's all fiction, isn't it? So they've got more freedom to especially express the intense ambivalence that comes with certain aspects of motherhood, certain phases in your child's life, certain phases in your own life, that I think the rest of us are still very wary of voicing. And there are a couple of them. Megan Hunter's The Harpy, but also there was this one that I read, and it was so fascinating because it was set, she was an archaeologist and she was on a dig, but she also had a young child, and it transpired that she thought there was an intruder, and that intruder was actually her other set. It was herself, some other version of herself. And there was a time slip theme, but it was just, that feeling of being so close to the person that you were, and having your life change so radically, so quickly, and just feeling sort of physically bludgeoned by the whole experience. And also then I think just the sheer drudgery that none of us are prepared for, male or female, that comes with having a very small infant in the house. It's a strange time, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, fiction really has great power really to depict and therefore critique some of the tensions of motherhood, and also some great non-fiction books. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex is amazing on motherhood, actually, depicting that some of its ambivalences and Adrian Rich's of Woman Born, which is kind of almost novelistic actually in its depictions of taking the kids off for a holiday, and breaking all the rules, staying up late. They don't have any baths, but yet she feels like this is a glimpse of what motherhood, without those societal constraints could actually look like, and but yeah, I mean, there's so many amazing depictions. Of course, classic, I think this Rachel Cusk's Life's Work, which is still
and that I feel like that was one
realistic.
of the, that seems like it was one of the first books of this current crop to have, she was the first to put her head above the parapet and took some serious flack for it.
She did, and it's just always been baffling to me, because to me, when I read that book, it just seemed so realistic. It didn't seem negative or pejorative at all. I mean, she was showing the downsides, obviously, but motherhood, does contain downsides, and ambivalence is part of the experience. But I think what's happened now is that, apart from fiction, perhaps, and some non-fiction, handful of non-fiction books, the ideal of motherhood is supposed to be devoid of ambivalence. It's supposed to be just a purely joyful experience, and yet it's not. How could it be? Donald Winnicott, when he wrote that fantastic essay, Hate and the Countertransference, in 1949, he listed 18 reasons why mothers naturally hate their infants, and it's just brilliant about how they misbehave, and then they go to stay with their aunt, and they behave beautifully, and she says, "Oh, isn't he sweet?" And then all they care about is what's in the cupboard in the kitchen, and the child treats the mother like a slave, and it's never any gratitude, so anyway, but so I just think the recognition of ambivalence and the reasons why mothers are obviously ambivalent, those reasons have been forgotten now. And yet Winnicott, he was a child psychologist, and he was really influential in his time. Even John Bowlby, actually, who was even more conservative really than Winnicott, he said, well, if you're going to take a holiday away from your kids, make sure it's only a week or 10 days. And I just think most of my mum friends now, they feel guilty going away for a weekend. So it just shows you how mores have shifted, and expectations have become even more perfectionist and conservative now, in a time when we're supposed to be liberated, and women are supposed to have free choices and be empowered, and all of these things, which in many ways women are, well, but definitely not when it comes to motherhood.
Was there anything in your, I know you spent a lot of time in the Wellcome Institute Library, was there anything that you turned up that was just joyously surprising?
Well, the eugenic origins of natural childbirth, I think, was one of the more eye-opening chapters. So the natural so the NCT started out as the Natural Childbirth Association in 1956, and the first president was a man called Grantley Dick Reed, and he wrote explicitly that that his method was aimed at the sort of more well-heeled and better sort of women, because we must be alert to improve our stock after the population losses of the Second World War and so on, and so it was particularly ironic because he was actually pointing to so-called tribal women as examples of women who were supposed to be able to give birth really easily without any medication or anesthesia, which is obviously a myth. But so he kind of idealized these non-Western women and sort of peasant women, as he would term them, but his message was aimed at middle and upper class British and American women. So and really it was part of a general effort to get women back to the kitchen after they'd been out to work in the Second World War. So so there's lots of kind of troubling archetypes and stereotypes at play there, I think, both kind of racist stereotypes, but also it's something very dubious about persuading educated career women, as I guess they would have been termed, to sort of give up their jobs and embrace their domestic destinies.
Do you have a sense that, I mean, you can only write about, I mean, I love that your book is so flavored with your own personal experience, and I think it's a sort of an Anglophone world that is at our fingertips, and it's hard to get any real familiarity and depth when we're looking at other cultures. But do you have any sense, even within Europe, of other countries doing it differently? I mean, we always look to things France, where they're allowed to drink during pregnancy, and they certainly used to be. I don't know if it's still the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at things like epidural rates, they're quite low in this country. They're under 20%, whereas in Paris they're 90%. Yeah, I mean, Norwegian babies left out in the cold. It's
yes, yeah, in the box, yes.
Strengthen their nerves. Japanese children travel on the underground when they're 8 or 9. Italian children, I think, drink alcohol when they're teenagers, in moderation, I hope. But so there's great variation internationally. I mean, particularly things like also childcare and work. So patterns of other family members or networks, communal networks, looking after children while women get to work. So I think it's really, these contrasts really shed a liberating light on these very narrow rules and norms that we have in the elite West. I think the fact that French women were wouldn't be able to believe it if you said you were not choosing not to have an epidural, kind of whatever you think about anesthesia in childbirth, at least it gives you the option that that there are these different norms in different countries, and that therefore there is genuine choice in many areas.
If you could change one aspect of this incredible industry reinforced by all our social mores and the history that underpins it all, to make things feel less onerous and more personalized and just more pleasant, to use at a most basic level, what is the one thing that you could think of altering?
Well, I can't keep to one, but I guess on my wish list,
or a whole list.
Well, things like
I mean, I guess I'm thinking of better paternity leave is one of them.
So work is clearly just a massive obstacle to equality between the sexes. So changes like a 4-day week for everyone, men and women, I think would help, because there's a great inequality between mothers and fathers in terms of childcare and domestic work. So I think reducing working hours for everyone would help. The current system of shared parental leave is not functioning. So that needs attention. But I think work is really being rethought on a macro scale at the moment. I think if that could give fuel to improving motherhood, then that would be a great thing. But I think other changes would help a lot as well. So really talking to the medical community to improve public health messaging, so that there isn't so much of a mismatch between the advice and women's lived experience. So reducing panic around fertility, having a more realistic message around management of pregnancy, alcohol in pregnancy and things like that. So not having a sort of paternalistic attitude, but treating women like autonomous agents, as the rest of the population are treated. And then just improving infrastructure really for new mothers, because postnatal depression is incredibly high incidence, and mental health problems in general. So we really need a proper state infrastructure around new motherhood, so not leaving it just to informal networks like the NCT or breastfeeding drop-ins. That there really needs to be a concerted effort to improve postnatal care. But and just general, I want to see a broader shift in public attitudes to legitimize maternal imperfection, and to try and reduce the burden of guilt that women feel, and increase their ability to make choices in their interests as well as their children, because obviously those are one and the same thing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's the kind of thing that seems to be begging for a hashtag, but actually what we get are those, as you mentioned, those awful, mummy drinks, wine o'clock, merchandising things that are all over Etsy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
not going to do it, is it?
Well, the idea that the only solution is just to drink through it, rather than actually come together and try and affect some macro change.
Yeah. I think we might be ready for questions now. Shall I see what's popped up in the? I'm going to try and take these in the order that they've been posed. So Marie C says, I'm thinking about the guilt that new mothers, or those people thinking about procreating, feel in relation to talk of bringing children into a world devastated by climate change. Is this something Eliane takes seriously into consideration? And if so, what should the response be? Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing you can do to save the planet is not have a child, right?
Well, although I spoke to a geographer, Danny Dorling, and he said it's not actually about having a child or not having a child, it's about your carbon footprint that really makes the difference. So I think there are different views on that question. I think it's, of course, a legitimate choice to not have children. I think it's so difficult, really, that dilemma that women are being dealt, and men, which is it's sort of unanswerable, really, that dilemma. I mean, I guess I would say that there's still, I think, great pressure to have children. Even so, I think that there's still this assumption that to be a fulfilled woman, you need to be a mother. And I would contrast that with a previous generation of feminists who campaigned for the right to remain childless and for that to be a legitimate state. So I wish there was more diversity, really, in terms of the pressure to become a mother. But perhaps that will be more challenged now because of this environmental factor.
I suppose it might energize the movement of women who are actively choosing this consciously and feeling good about that as a decision, rather than feeling it's something that's been foisted upon them by circumstances. And and I suppose the other thing which you do touch on in your book is that children symbolize so much, not least of which hope and new beginning. And I think if you do have a child, then you certainly have skin in the game, and it's incredibly motivating, isn't it, in terms of thinking about your carbon footprint on a daily basis?
Yes, it is. Yes, that's the other side to it.
We have another question here from Joanna. I'm not going to murder your surname by saying it aloud. And she says, I'm wondering how, or if it is possible, to avoid the loneliness and isolation Eliane discusses due to the fragmenting of our social bonds. I'm thinking of work by Patricia Hill Collins and other mothering within Black feminist thought. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because we tend to live far away from those, like you said, the extended family units that would have picked up some of the slack. And
I mean, there's interesting examples that Sarah Knott, the historian who wrote Mother recently, she talks about other communities where, particularly African American communities in the States, where looking after other people's children is much more normalized. So I think it's really important to look at other communities and other, diversity of ways of bringing up children, and actually try and, I think there's some inspiring experiments actually in communal mothering.
I feel like The Atlantic is always good on this, and I'm sure I read something a while ago on single women having kids on their own but living in a sort of, they're all artists naturally, but living in a communal block, so there was shared childcare. And actually, wasn't there just going back to the question of work, I think in this country there is or at some point, I don't know, what the pandemic has done to this, but I think there were a group of artists who were looking into studio space that came with a sort of a creche that they all mucked in and helped out with every so often. So
and creches at work and kibbutzes. I mean, I guess the problem is, that they're really inspiring examples, but the question is how to scale that up, and
idealistic, don't they? And utopian and doomed to fail in the way that such things are, and rare,
I mean, in sort of Western individualized capitalism, it's quite hard to generalize that sort of provision. There are lots of new apps try and befriend other mums in the park and so on, but those have had real problems where you kind of swipe left or right, like dating apps, and then mothers are finding that if other mothers weren't swiping right, that would compound their feelings of isolation.
So I can't think of anything worse.
I just think, I think this calls for a structural solution. Like, I think loneliness comes with shame attached, and so it's self-reinforcing. And this psychologist who I spoke to you about, who was an expert in postnatal depression, and interviewed lots of women, said all of these problems are self-reinforcing, that shame makes you hide in your away at home even more. So I think, but if you have a structured solution, at least breastfeeding drop-ins, or when you take your child to a jab, then at least you kind of have to be there. But and so it destigmatizes that attempt to find other people. I guess Sure Start centres, they were a good example. Also, they were more kind of state instituted, and they've been really scaled back with a recent austerity. But also schemes like Home Start in the States, which actually use a network of volunteers to support new mothers, for more kind of grassroots solutions. So I think the models are out there.
Do you think we're mothers in general, to the extent that you can generalize any of this, will come out of the pandemic better off? Or there's everything that we read suggests that there's shouldering even more of this unfair burden, and just down at their ironing board desks and weeping with their glass of Chardonnay.
I really worry about the effect. As you say, all the signs are very negative about the effects of the pandemic. Everything from women being made to give birth alone, have miscarriages alone, to what it's done to work, and redundancies and so on have been exacerbated. Equality between the sexes has not improved, even though men were at home and they still were very reluctant to share the domestic load, which was very revealing. And in terms of work, personally, I don't want to work from home in the future, and I'm worried that all these sort of predictions about the office is dead and so on. I think, oh God, please ask the mothers who who've been multitasking for the last X years.
It's worth pointing out that your book is actually incredibly optimistic, but on a political level, in terms of our ability to change, but also on a very personal level, in terms of how the experience of motherhood changes. And you make the very valid point that our interest as an industry, and as all these experts and the books and the blogs, trails off as the children get to school and become more able to fend for themselves, which is actually in many ways when the relationship gets most interesting.
Yes, absolutely. It's almost, I remember being told so many times when the kids were young, oh, you just wait, when they were babies, people said, oh, you just wait till they're toddlers. And I'm sure that the teenage stage is hard too, but I think that it's almost like people don't want to tell you that it gets better in case you relax. It's an idea that if you give mothers an inch, they'll take a mile. But actually, my own experience has been that I've enjoyed motherhood more and more as I've got better at doing it, and they've got easier to deal with, and it's a virtuous circle. And actually, the sort of theorists of motherhood, from a generation ago, Rosika Parker, who wrote a fantastic book about maternal ambivalence, called Torn in Two, but she says, she describes this virtuous circle of mothers feeling more confident to bring up these increasingly good children, and they become increasingly good mothers, and so everyone becomes more and more confident and relaxed. And I think there's I think so many motherhood books are about the early stage, about the baby stage. There's this great focus on the early years, the first 3 years movement. The stakes are so raised so high in that early stage, but actually what I've realized now is that firstly the whole experience becomes so much better, but also that those decisions, those choices that I agonized over when my babies were young, just didn't matter either way.
Yeah.
You know, it just doesn't matter whether they were in a
it's sort of giving
forward-facing buggy
or exactly, it's giving you the
buggy.
illusion of autonomy, where it's actually not very helpful to have at all. And again, it's a complete illusion, isn't it? Because it's a choice between two very similar things, or two polar opposites. And yeah.
If I'd known that, I just could have just relaxed and just kind of relaxed into the experience, which would have been better for everyone. I mean, I had you know, which is not to say I had a
but you see, there you go, now you're criticizing yourself again. You see,
well, exactly.
it's impossible, isn't it, to yes. I mean, I did put your book down thinking, you know, every thought I have about myself as a mother is somehow you know, it's not even mine. I feel like I've got this voice trapped in my head that's come from you know, just absorbed by osmosis somehow, but of course not by osmosis. You know, it's there in the culture throughout, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think those and those moments when you can be like Adrienne Rich and just experiment with just dispensing with those meal times, bedtimes, you know, because Adrienne Rich, she describes coming back from the holiday, and she comes back into the city after this glorious week away, and she said, you know, as soon as she drove back, you know, towards her home, she felt the influence of those norms and rules of, you know, sort of perfect parenting return, and she had internalized them herself. You know, it wasn't, you know, she was as much, you know, responsible to blame as the culture, but there was just that little glimpse in the middle.
I suppose it's that they're inherently anarchic, aren't they, babies? I mean, they just don't obey any rules, so maybe that's where society has to really, you know, tighten the screws and instill this sense of order. And
but I think historically, you know, that controlling unruly children was, you know, the attention was on controlling children's behavior, and I think what's happened is there's been a shift now to controlling mothers' behavior,
but it's still controlling the child's experience of
but it's optimizing everything for the child, but controlling the mother in a way that's just impossible.
And yet also not great for the child either, because, you know, they're not climbing trees, they're not doing, as you say, they're and yet they're exposed to all these, they're in a kind of Grimm's fairy tale forest online.
Exactly.
I'm gonna take another question from Marie C, who says, what does Eliane mean by motherhood being feminism's unfinished business? Does she think it's currently the biggest question for feminists to address?
I guess I look back to all of that amazing work of a previous generation of feminists who campaigned for 24-hour nurseries and you know, questioning the norms of the nuclear family, and I just feel like that discussion is just not really being had at the moment. So and I feel that you know, young women who are given these liberating messages, you know, girls at school in careers presentations told you can do whatever you want to do, and then they have a child and bam, you know, it all goes out the window. And so many of my friends, you know, say, you know, I was speaking to a friend the other day who said, I grew up as a young feminist, and yet it was motherhood that got me. And so it's almost like there's this exception in terms of equality where motherhood is concerned, and so really I wanted to explore, you know, where that exception comes from and how can we dismantle it. You know, how can we include mothers in our desire for equality for women, because at the moment I feel like mothers are left out of that. You know, they're treated like children really, but also expected to be responsible and mature at all times. And I just think the way that mothers are meant to behave, you know, from everything from avoiding a whole list of foods and drinks in pregnancy, to being traumatized by childbirth, to being lonely and isolated after birth, to having to give up their career because their work doesn't fit in with school hours. You know, all of these kind of unnecessary problems are really compromising women's mothers' ability to achieve equality with men.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is, you know, maybe it's not a question for feminists or not only for feminists, and that, you know, really that there still are generally two genders in you know, in each parenting unit, and you know, maybe we just can't do it on our own in terms of making this change happen.
Yeah, I mean, men, there's still huge inequality.
I hope men are going to read this book. I'm sure they are.
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, lots of men wrote to me actually after I wrote that article in The Guardian saying, yeah, it's really, you know,
yeah,
full-time dads are stereotyped, you know, they're patronized, or they're told that, oh, you're such a hero, you know.
Yeah, it's true. They get
they're called wimps, you know. It's really hard for them, but there are really very few of them. And I think if you look at care work in general, you know, motherhood, but also, you know, nursery care, all kinds of care. Yeah, it's just overwhelmingly dominated by women, and that's just shouldn't be the case.
No. I've got one other question here from Helen Rogers. I'm curious, she says, who would you say is controlling mothers? Again, you know, it's hard to put your finger on this, isn't it? Social norms, the media, the government. How do you break out of the constrictions you find yourself in?
Yeah, who's controlling mothers? I mean, I guess, you know, it comes from all different levels. So you have the public health advice, you know, for example, breastfeeding advice to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months, but only 1% of women in the UK actually do that. So there's a huge gap between the messaging and the reality. And of course, you know, breastfeeding rates are unusually low in this country, but how can we kind of close that gap so that women are feeling less anxious and guilty if they can't breastfeed, you know, or find it really difficult or painful to breastfeed. So it's public health messaging. I think the advice industry has a lot to answer for. You know, a lot of the advice is very perfectionist and zero tolerance. And actually, if you speak to psychologists and psychiatrists now, they're much more tolerant about the realities of mothering than the advice industry is. And then the media, you know, I guess, I mean, the Daily Mail is the kind of, you know, stereotype culprit here, but, you know, there's countless headlines that I've referred to in the book about.
Yeah, you're right. You get, it's everywhere, isn't it?
Too posh to push, you know, career women delaying motherhood.
Yeah.
So, and then down to the message boards, you know, and that kind of the way that those messages are perpetuated. So I think, how do you break out of it? I think, you know, that's really why I wrote this book, is that I wanted to point to different historical attitudes and practices and different practices around the world that challenge the norms that we've been dealt, so that we can start to question those and have confidence to parent in a way that we think is good for us and for our children. So I do believe in consciousness raising through writing and talking, so that more women, you know, have the license, or more mothers have the license to question that those norms that they've been dealt.
I'm just checking how we're doing for time. We've got 3 more minutes left. If anybody has a last burning question, now is your turn. Now is your chance. See, ordinarily we'd be funneling people to a little table where you'd be sitting signing copies of this fabulous book, but I suppose we'll just have to urge you to go to your nearest independent bookseller and buy it, because it's definitely our first weapon in this this quest to bring some sanity to bear on this experience. We've got reminders popping up in the chat. There we go. Reminders about where to buy your book. I mean, is there anything, just I suppose, just briefly, to the extent that you've had questions and feedback, has there been anything in that surprised you, cheered you, demoralized you? But can I spend on an upbeat note?
Yeah, I mean, I was incredibly cheered, well, moved and touched mostly, but also cheered by some of the responses that you know, women writing to me saying, thank you for making me feel seen. And I think, you know, I really believe in the value of honesty. You know, I'm quite confessional in this book. You know, I do talk about my own failings.
You absolutely are. Yeah.
Just because I think, you know, the idealization of motherhood is everywhere, but actually, if the more of us kind of talk about our imperfections, then the more that other mothers think, okay, it's not just me, and I'm doing all right, and then you get onto that virtuous circle and you kind of relax and feel more confident in your parenting. So yeah, I was really cheered by that, and yeah, I am optimistic that the more of us are aware of the kind of reality that we're all in the same boat, we all have very similar experiences, even though we're very isolated in our own homes. But actually, by knowing that we're not alone, I think it enables us to make more demands.